Welcome to our second official FCC podcast. You could be potentially streaming in on YouTube or also listening to the audio through your favourite podcast app. It's great for you to be with us. We've had a bit of a stuttering start to FCC Podcast Live, unfortunately. We actually recorded one a couple of months ago, a couple of weeks ago, can't remember which, and we didn't do the audio. And obviously, with the situation being what it is, time's precious, our churches are coming out of lockdown, all this sort of stuff. So it's really hard to find little pockets of time when we can record stuff. So we do apologise. We did say we were going to try and do these kind of monthly, but we were thwarted in our plans, would be the best way to describe that, by my ineptitude. I shouldn't blame Michael. Tim's ineptitude with technology. So we do apologise for that, but we are planning to release some stuff between now and Christmas. We have some stuff backlogged, as well as into the new year, so you have plenty of things to think about as we think and delve into what it means to be the fellowship of congregational churches. So we're stoked that you're listening with us. Today we're going to be chatting to our president, Michael Hunt. Say hello, Michael.
Hey Tim. Hey, look, it's not ineptitude. You need to be a bit more kinder on yourself.
Thanks,
and
man.
thank you to all those who've given their encouragement from listening to our first episode, because we're still beginners in this. No one started 2020 thinking that we were going to be podcasters and vloggers or anything along those lines. So thank you for all of your feedback on everything so far. And yes, we hope with the change in circumstances to be able to get these out more regularly. And Tim, you've been doing a fantastic job on all that kind of stuff so far.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks. Like I said, we're trying to get our heads around some new technology. In terms of pushing into today, though, we're really going to spend some time talking about your journey, about how you came to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus, how you maybe moved into ministry, and even what brought you to our circles here in Sydney. So really broad brushstrokes. Let me throw to that. How did you... Well, I know you didn't grow up in Sydney, you grew up in WA. So maybe just point us how you became a Christian, where you grew up, what was your life like when you were a kid, and how did your life move in that direction?
Well, I think sometimes in Christian circles there's two types of testimonies, and that's kind of what I think you're kind of asking me. There's a testimony which is probably more in line of yours. Grew up in a church environment and came to faith through the normal cycles and rhythms of the life of the church. For myself, I'm on that other spectrum. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I actually grew up in a foster family, and from a very young age, and time's probably too short for me to kind of elaborate on that. I was placed with a foster family from a very young age. And I don't look upon that as a negative thing. It does have ramifications and shaping on who I am. But I see in that situation the beginning of what I think is critical to every story, whether one grows up in the church or not, that God watches over every aspect of our lives. And God placed me with a certain family, not a Christian family, but by His grace and mercy, He led me on a path of coming to faith and to trust in Him, kind of thing. So some backgrounds. Yes, I'm from Western Australia. I was originally born in South Australia. Don't hold that against me. But because of my situation, I landed in foster care in WA. And from the age of 4, I was placed with this particular foster family. And it was from there that my journey of faith kind of started. And so, as I mentioned, firstly, I see God's providential hand in placing me in that particular family. The second providential thing that I see is that a friend from school, his mother was a Sunday school teacher at the Armidale Congregational Church.
Wow, Armidale.
Yeah. So Armidale in Western Australia, not Armidale in New South Wales. Or I think there's even an Armidale in Victoria as well. Packages get mixed up in different places. Armidale Congregational Church was one of those churches that didn't go into the Uniting Church. However, it was, because of time and distance, WA, not part of the fellowship, an independent church. But again, looking thinking back on God's providence, there was a time that a minister there, Neville Blackhall, who was at Revesby Congregational Church, was ministering over there at Armidale.
Wow.
So Armidale Congregational Church ran a Sunday school in the local primary school, and my friend from school, his mum was a Sunday school teacher, and she invited me along to Sunday school to come along. And like most kids, I got a Good News Bible with all of its stick drawings and learnt all about that, and learned all those Sunday school songs. Father Abraham has many sons, those kinds of things. And yet, not in a Christian home or anything along those lines. The interesting thing that I've always found, and again, this is another aspect of God's watching over and providence, is I found something really quite interesting about that group of people. I would say I was a boy that grew up on the wrong side of the railway tracks. Being in foster care, one of the things was kind of finding who I was, my identity, my place, where did I belong, what was my story. And amongst these group of people, I found a group of people who took me where I was at and loved me. And I believe that love was motivated by the grace and kindness of Jesus. And there in that Sunday school, a teacher gave us a lesson and asked us a question. If you were to die and you were to go to heaven, what would you say to God to allow you in? And look, I think all of us did what probably most young kids did, was saying, oh, well, I'm not as bad as such and such, or I didn't do this, or, I read my Bible, I come to Sunday school, I do all of these things. And yet I recall that the Sunday school teacher said, and I'm paraphrasing it here, that there is no other way for us to get into heaven but by what Jesus has done. It's not by anything of ourselves, it's what he has accomplished. And I think that was the spark of faith in me. I can't do this. I need someone else to do this for me. Now, that was with all the naivety of a little child, not understanding, all of the aspects of the gospel, but I think the beginning part of a walk of faith. And then as the years progressed, various different things happened. Sadly, at the age of 12, my foster brother, who was 18 months older than me, was tragically killed in a train accident. And that again, that was a providential thing. We say God's in control of so many things in our lives. I don't mean that God ordained this terrible and tragic thing to happen, but God used, as Romans tells us, even the terrible and difficult things of this life to draw and bring myself to him. Because I got angry with God. I got angry that God, I felt, allowed this to happen. And in my teenage years, I spent some time trying to find myself, being a little bit, I suppose, angsty as teenagers are, and not really having much of a place with God in my life. I'd sort of neglected going to Sunday school or youth group activities and things like that. But at the age of 15, a little local Baptist church was running a boys' brigade, and my mum said, would I like to go? She saw this little postage stamp style article in the newspaper, and she said, how about you go to that? So I went along, and again, I found this group of people that cared for me, this mixed up, troubled, now teenager. And I was attracted to what they were saying. And I was also attracted to that they were seemingly able to live this out when I had difficulty kind of, controlling my emotions and feeling, all this angst and everything along those lines. I wanted to be a part of this community. I wanted to do the things that they, were formative for them, I wanted to behave in the way that they did. And a book was given to me called The Holiness of God. I picked it up because I thought, here's how one can live a kind of a good life kind of stuff.
Who wrote that? Was that Stott?
No, R.C. Sproul.
Oh, right.
R.C. Sproul wrote Holiness of God,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
And in reading it, I came to the realisation that God in his holiness and his grandeur was actually far more bigger than what I actually thought. You know, like, I probably had something of a mix between the loving God of Jesus and occasional kind of, thunder and lightning kind of God of the Old Testament. But R.C. Sproul did this wonderful thing of being able to show that God is holy, that anyone who comes into his presence and is sinful, God is justified to strike them down because human righteousness and God's righteousness are so distant and so apart from each other. And as I was reading that, I was becoming more convicted. I was like, rather than feeling good by this book, I was feeling kind of like, this is scary. And so, of course, then the question came up. Well, we come to the New Testament, we hear about the lovingness of Jesus. How do we reconcile a loving God and a holy God? And Sproul made the fantastic thing of a loving and holy God. These aspects of God are reconciled in Jesus because Jesus dies for rebels. Jesus dies for broken people like myself. Jesus demonstrated God's love so much that he took my place for me. And it was one of those lightning bolt testimonial kinds of things. When I realised that, God, you love me that much, that this is what you did for me, I just broke. And so it was like one of those lightning bolt moments where I realised, this is how much God loved me. What was I to do? And so my response was, well, God, here's my life, take it and use it. I basically said to God, if you want me to go to Bible college, I'll go to Bible college. If you want me to be a pastor, I'll be a pastor. If you want me to go to the mission field, I'll be a missionary. Here's my life, take it and use it. I think there was something wonderful about the heritage of the churches that I'd been in, that kind of thing was the natural outworking of what it meant to live the Christian life, like to give your life over to God. So what my life has been since then is a journey of working those things out. And I've been to Bible college twice, I've been a missionary, I've been a pastor at various different times. I kind of wonder, like, when I do something the first time, maybe God wants me to go back and repeat it again, kind of thing.
Yeah, okay, so obviously you became a Christian, you're about 18, is that right?
So I was 15.
15,
yeah.
Okay. So obviously you finished school, then you went, I'm trying to remember, you did some sort of ministry traineeship or something?
No, so in my final 2 years of school, there was a time when I think, I wanted to join the Air Force. I wanted to, have all of the experience and all those kinds of things that came with that. I was very enamoured by the kind of glossy kind of brochure presentation. And look, this was the Top Gun days as well. I played a lot of games, everything along those lines. Yeah. But having had this experience, I knew my life was not my own, it was God's. And when a Bible college from New South Wales came over and visited churches in WA, I was taken with the program that was on offer. At that stage, I had started dating my now wife, Amanda, and again, that's another story for another time to kind of unpack. But neither of us realised in God's providence that God was calling each one of us, her and myself, to go to this Bible college after we finished high school. And so we had this scenario and situation where we kind of approached each other tentatively with the news that we were feeling God was telling us to go to New South Wales to Bible college straight out of high school. And again, God's providence in sort of watching over. This was a missionary college, and so the thoughts and ideas were that we would go off and do some missionary service. I suppose, condense down a few years. Basically, after college finished, it was wise counsel. So the Bible College was a missionary college, and it would have been very easy to go off and do missionary service as a result of that. But we were given some very wise counsel, and by that stage, my relationship with Amanda had moved from one of dating to one where we were engaged. And so the advice was given to me that, I didn't have a lot of sort of other skills. I didn't have any kind of employable kind of skills. And so maybe there was a time to look at maybe either getting a trade or some other kind of experience. And this resulted in me actually taking up one of my other interests, which was IT, and working in the IT industry for a number of years. And during that time, Amanda and I got married, and we were quite involved in our local church, and both of us felt that to stay in the local church, continue in our jobs as we were doing, to earn money was not what we felt that God wanted us to use our lives for. And at that point, we basically started a journey of looking where to go, and we wrote to different mission agencies. A long story short, all the mission agencies said, "Yeah, we can use you," and in the end, we ended up going out with SIM to Sahel Academy in Niger in early 2001.
Well, you were pretty young.
Yeah, so we had our 5th wedding anniversary. I turned 25 in the Sahara. And we were pretty young. We were pretty green. I think probably I was more headstrong. I don't think I knew all of the answers and things like that. And yet, again, God in His providence, through a church setting, a cross-cultural church setting, both made me realise just how beautiful it is, how wonderful it is to see what's talked about in Revelation, that we're going to be gathered with all nations, and God's calling all people. From this predominantly Muslim country, people were coming to faith in Christ, and we were worshipping with them. And a realisation that also maybe the things that I thought were important in terms of what it looked like when a church gathered were not necessarily things that were, to be held as strongly as maybe I did.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah.
So what do you mean, baptism, or what are you talking about there? So
a couple of things. You probably know from some of your experience with travelling overseas to churches, it's not uncommon in particularly African countries for chickens and dogs also to make their way, for a service to run 3 hours. Yeah. For sometimes they're not to be the orderliness. We say we're going to start at this time, but we don't often. There's sometimes to be 3 sermons in the service and things along those lines. I'm not necessarily saying all of that is sort of replicable and we should, take that on board, but I think what happened was, it was very easy to come, as I suppose I came. A church service is done this way. You come in, we all sit, we start on time, the worship leader gets up, you have your 3 hymns, then you have your sermon, and it's all done and dusted in an hour and, 10 minutes kind of stuff.
Sure.
There was a whole lot more about what it meant to live lives in community and what it meant to care and to see pastors as well, not paid a salary because people didn't have a lot of finance, but having to work alongside of people on their gardens and their farms, and to see what worship looked like as well. To see people singing their songs in their own language. And along with that was worshipping with people who were Baptists, like I was myself at that stage, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and people from all other backgrounds, and also from all other nations, because my missionary workers were from all around the world, and so we have valued all things kind of differently as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Interesting you raise some of those things, because obviously you found yourself working in a Baptist church. You came back to Australia.
Yep.
I think that's right. You worked in a Baptist church, then eventually in a Cong church. And there's obviously a lot of overlap there, even though some of our listeners or watchers may not be aware of that. But I mean, how did that happen? So, you started working, you came back to Australia, obviously?
So, after our time in Africa, we came back and we said, is vocational missionary service for us? Is that what God is calling us to? And for a season and for a time, I would and still would have, and still in a way, would love to live overseas and to be in that environment. Cross-cultural experiences, different lands, different tastes, different foods, they're all appealing, I mean, I get why it's been difficult for a certain generation now to have closed borders and not to be able to live out the idea of going and seeing some of these places. Our eldest daughter would love the idea of going to Paris and things like that. But what happened was when we came back, we realised that we needed to be equipped for whatever the next season of ministry service was going to be. And my wife, who'd been teaching art in the school, considered the idea of training to be an art teacher. And so she did a bachelor's degree in visual arts at Edith Cowan University in WA. For myself, having spent some time working in the school environment, I realised that I probably was not going to be a teacher. But what I did enjoy was one of the ministry experiences that I had in Niger, in West Africa, was working with university students. And I realised that I wanted to see churches planted, and if there was a way that I could be trained to work alongside of church planters and people in that forefront, coalface of ministry, then I was going to need equipping. My 2 years of Bible college were not going to be sort of suitable. And I also thought that maybe after a period of season of ministry and missionary service at a younger age, I might come back to Australia, once my kids were grown up, and then, God might call us to pastoral ministry. Now, God seemed to providentially have things around differently, and I entered into theological college, studied at Trinity Theological College in Perth, and did a Bachelor of Theology.
That's a pretty stock standard reform.
Yeah, so quite a few guys. I mean, it was kind of known a little bit as the West Coast Law, because there were a few Anglican guys.
I've heard that.
Yeah, but they, are strongly reformed, and again, it was actually quite a bit different from some of the more. The Baptist circles that I came from were more dispensational, and so there was, again, a theological journey that I went through in college, which someone said to me, what they observed, and I'm really grateful for their comment, was that that's made me much more well-rounded theologically, and having gone through that experience, I understand why I value certain theological positions. When you wrestle with them in that kind of way, and not just accept it because it was what was taught to you, kind of thing. There's a real value in it.
It's also a difference from the fact that I was raised in Sydney and I grew up in these theological, you could even call it a bubble.
Yeah.
Whereas I know it's not the case if you grew up in, say, Adelaide or WA. There's a lot more of a spread, rightly or wrongly, of theological convictions.
Yeah.
Whereas in Sydney it's evangelical, generally speaking.
Yeah.
So, it must be different to grow up in that context. You probably had conversations and encounters that I haven't had. With people who are very different, like you were saying, dispensationalists. I don't think I've ever met a dispensationalist, so maybe I have, but not very often.
No.
So it's very different growing up in WA. But then you went on to pastor a church.
Yes. So I was working for SIM for a period of time in a support raising kind of role. It was something that we continued in from our time in Africa. And a role came up for an associate pastor's position in a Baptist church. And for a while I did both jobs together while having a young family. And, that was both a good thing, and it also had, its struggles as well, trying to maintain, two hats with a very young family as well. The long and the short of it was that after 10 years, the time with SIM finished up, and then we came to a certain point in my role as an associate where I felt that it was time for me to conclude ministry there in that church. And I didn't know what God would have for me. And so it was that time that I saw an advertisement for Revesby Congregational Church in the briefing. Yep. And because of my involvement with SIM, I knew Steve Shooter, who had been a congregational minister. He was an SIM fellow worker, and the long and the short of it of a discussion with him was Steve said, I think you should apply and I'm happy to referee for you. And so here was this great thing that someone that was very well known by Revesby and who they trusted.
Well known in pretty much all
Cong circles. And also who could say hand on heart, well knew me because he'd done ministry alongside of me for a number of years, was able to facilitate myself coming to Revesby. And again, God in his providence brought me to ministry at Revesby Congregational Church. And ironically, as I said, Neville Blackhall, who'd gone from Revesby to Armidale Congregational Church, I didn't know where Revesby was. I had no idea,
somewhere in Sydney.
Yeah, somewhere in Sydney.
So what was there common ground? I mean, you're saying, I think of Baptists and Congregationalists as being actually really similar, even though not everyone is aware of that, but ecclesiologically they're similar. I mean, was there common ground? Was there commonality when you came over, or was it a very different context?
No, there's certainly a lot of commonality. And again, congregationalism in terms of its ecclesiology can mean different things to different people.
Yes.
And Baptists can practice an ecclesiology of congregationalism that is probably quite familiar with what we practice. And I would say the kind of Baptist churches that I was a part of, that congregational model and ecclesiology was, almost an exact kind of replica kind of stuff. Probably the main difference was on the issue of baptism, because the heritage of some of our churches is that we allow for, infant baptism. And so that was something that the church and I had to discuss and talk about. And it was an interesting thing, I suppose, also having gone to a college that was non-denominational. I'd actually done some quite heavy thinking about what my views on baptism were. And I don't want to be saying that I changed them at the moment that I interviewed and had a sudden revelation from God. But there had been a process where I felt comfortable with what Revesby was asking specifically for their pastor. But generally, apart from that particular issue, it felt very comfortable and very familiar. I was going from something that I'd been a part of and done ministry into something very similar here.
Like I can think of several people who have transgressed. No, it's the wrong way. Crossed over from Baptist circles to Cong circles. I can think of. Rattle off names. But obviously, you found enough commonality in the Cong circles for you to even become involved in the wider fellowship. Yeah. So that happened pretty early on in your time.
Well, because of my involvement with missions, Alan Best, sort of said, I think maybe even 6 months. He said, there's a space coming up on the mission committee. Would you put your hand in it? And so I said, look, I'm quite interested in getting involved in the wider fellowship. I always think that, the church doesn't stop at the end of the car park that, you're a part of. We may be autonomous, independent churches, but the church extends beyond just the local gathering of the congregation. And healthy autonomous churches operate by being part of a healthy body of churches.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, I know, it is.
I mean, it's a big, a lot of people would challenge even that, like we're a congregational, but by very definition, we're autonomous. So how does that relate to the greater body? But obviously you think it's a big relationship because you've engaged that in your practice, so yeah.
Yeah, and as much as you see Paul going around creating and calling, for elders to be appointed and for what we would feel very comfortable, a congregational ecclesiology, Paul took a great interest in each of these churches, and the churches took a great interest in what was happening elsewhere, because that's what it is to be part of the body. Now, there have got to be some organisational distinctives and some structures that may see that certain decisions fall in certain places and fall in other places. But going back to my wider involvement within the FCC, I didn't see it as an optional thing. It's like, if I'm ministering to the body of Christ, then I'm ministering to the body of Christ primarily as the pastor of the local church, but not to the exclusion of everything else.
Yeah. So in my time, I've known you, obviously, the ministry committee, missionary committee, or whatever.
Youth committee. There was a time there.
The youth committee we were together. Obviously, I think I've been involved in junior camp, which is a ministry we do up in Hazelbrook, a camp ministry. You've been a camp parent
for a couple of years.
And now you're doing executive / now you're the president.
Yep.
And that feeds into what you're thinking about, this greater vision for the whole denomination, not just Revesby Cong. So, again, this is probably another podcast, and I'm conscious of time. But where do you see the fellowship going? What do you hope for the fellowship? And like I said, we'll wrap with this and maybe pick this up another time. But in really sort of brief brushstrokes, where do you see the FCC going under you as president? Where do you hope?
Well, look, I think there's a twofold thing. One is the work of the gospel, the desire for us to take the message to those that are surrounding us. And one thing I would say, as someone who's gone overseas to take the gospel to people who've never heard, is living in Bankstown. We've got all these nations on our doorstep. So there's a work that I see for the fellowship that we want to continue as we have always done, making the gospel known, and that will involve planting churches, establishing churches, seeing areas where there isn't an evangelical outreach. Maybe, as Congregationalists have done well in the past, partnering with other church bodies. We are in an interesting space in the 2020s of modern Australia. The denominational landscape has shifted quite dramatically from where it was in the 1970s with the formation of our fellowship. So that's one part of what I want to see, us continuing to take the gospel out.
So replanting, revitalising.
Well, that's the second part.
Okay. Yep.
And the second part is
Jumping the gun.
The second part is this: the work of the gospel is. Each one of us being created in the image of God, being formed in that way. Yes, by nature of the sin that resides in us, we become broken and fallen vessels. But God is doing a restoration work inside of us individually. And I believe that for us as a fellowship, there's a twofold thing that we want to be doing, is planting and establishing churches, but revitalising and renewing as the gospel does in our lives, redeeming and restoring us. Much of our heritage as a fellowship is about holding firm to God's word at a time when maybe the Congregational Union had lost its way on that. Here is the thing, for our generation and for this next generation coming through, we want to see that great heritage, but we want to build on it. We stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us, and we want to see our churches redeemed and restored and renewed by this message of the gospel.
Yeah, that's good.
So we've got a great heritage, and I don't just mean in terms of physical and tangible assets. Historically, Congregationalists in Australia have this brilliant story to tell.
Theologically, I think we have great heritage as well.
Yeah. And I think there is an interesting place place in the denominational landscape for Congregationalists not to grow our own identity, but for God's glory and for the work of the gospel, grow ministry here in Australia. And it's going to be a twofold thing. It's going to be doing new things, and it's going to be through renewing the existing churches and seeing us be everything under God that He has made us to be.
That's an awesome place to finish. I think we're giving our listeners and giving ourselves a lot of food for thought there, particularly as we think about the future of the fellowship. But thanks for opening up your heart, telling your story. I think it's good for us to get to know you, because some people may not know some of those things in your story and your narrative and how you came to be in the position that you're in. So thanks for that.
That's right. And I'm going to say I've got to do now this for you. I'm going to have to take the C's and say, because people need to hear your story too, Tim.
I'm very mysterious, that's all I will. Anyway, we'll do that at some point. But anyway, feel free to subscribe, or don't feel free, please do subscribe. Like I said, we're going to have a lot more of this content. Subscribe, comment if you want to. I think the comments are enabled. So drop us a line. Give us ideas as well, because we're keen to do this across the whole fellowship and really use this as a way to unite us onto God's plan about where we're going to be going in the future. So thanks for listening again. Thanks to Michael for sharing, and hopefully we can see you next time.